All right, so let's move to the last exercise, which are a couple of multiple choice questions. So which of the following constitutes market failure? The inability of markets to internalize positive externalities, yeah, that's true. The inability of markets to internalize negative externalities, that's also true. So both A and B are correct. And again, a negative externality is typically illustrated on the demand function. So when we have, let's say, a market, and we have like a demand, and we have a supply, then the assumption is that the production of something creates additional costs to society, which however are not internalized. So they just linger on the society, or they just linger over the society, and those are costs, but they are not attributed to anyone. So this is basically supply plus social cost. Well, and in this case, an economist would say, well, the social optimum is, so we produce too much of a bad thing, so the price should be here, should be higher than the market equilibrium price, and the quantity turned over should be also much less than here in the equilibrium. and and so a negative externality is added to the demand and supply analysis by basically shifting up the supply curve, and the true welfare should be this one. So this should be the true consumer surplus, this little triangle up there, and the true producer surplus should be here. So this is now our reference scenario. Okay, but because the market clears here, well, people pay a much lower price than what should be, and in addition to that, the firms whose reservation price is in the equilibrium here, they basically still get the cost reduction because they can roll over the cost to the society. So that means they actually get a much higher price because they get a much higher per unit price because they don't have to pay the cost, which is like equivalent to having a higher unit price. So that's why we would say the true producer surplus is actually this triangle here without the internalization. The true consumer surplus is this one here. And now we can see again that we have this inefficient overproduction because the true social cost of producing something is actually, that should be the reservation price. And the true willingness to pay, however, is much less. So that means we get this deadweight loss from an inefficient overproduction. So this triangle would be the deadweight loss. Okay, it's a little bit small, but I think it is clear. So when it comes to positive externality, just to review again, so maybe it's a little bit bigger at least. So we have a demand function, we have a supply function, but now whenever we have a positive externality, then the demand function is this, So we get a much higher utility. So we have here the demand plus the social benefit. So positive externality is typically displayed on the demand side. So now we see that the social optimum, what should prevail, is this equilibrium here. So this is the social optimum. And we should then have this should be the true consumer surplus, this triangle up there. It should be the true consumer surplus, and the true producer surplus should be this one here. But because the market doesn't take into account that social benefit, the market clears at a much lower price here and a much lower quantity. So in other words, we produce too little of a good thing. With the negative externality, we produce too much of a bad thing. Okay, so now where do we have the deadweight loss? Well, the deadweight loss is because we produce too much of a good thing and the market clears here. We forego this triangle here as a welfare. So that is the deadweight loss here. Okay, but just to review again, so because we didn't have a numerical example earlier. Okay, when is the burden? Next question. When is the burden of an excise tax incidence equally shared between producers and consumers? So again, tax incidence relates to who pays the tax. And if you remember, if the slope of the supply function is the same as the slope, well, let's assume this is the same slope. I mean, the positive slope is the same as the negative slope in absolute terms. Then if I impose a tax, S plus T tax, then we know that the total tax revenue is this distance here. So people pay this at the cashier, but this is the price that the producers get. So this is the total tax revenue. But in the market equilibrium, we would have this one, and everything above would have been part of producers' consumer surplus. So if you just draw it, that used to be consumer surplus in the market equilibrium, and you see this chunk used to be consumer surplus that is now becoming the tax. And likewise, producer surplus would be this triangle under the market equilibrium, but after the tax, when the absolute slope of demand and the supply is equal, they pay this one in tax and it is equal. So the answer is when the absolute slope of the supply curve is the same as the one of the, so if the slope, the absolute slope of the demand and supply curve are the same. So that's the right answer. And then likewise, when is the burden of an excise tax fully carried by producers? And that is the case when the demand, when the supply is perfectly inelastic. So if, let's say, this is the supply function, and that is often the case in agriculture, and let's say this is the demand function, So now, if this is the price, the producers cannot roll over the tax to the consumers, because then the quantity demanded will fall possibly to zero. And that means, but because the supply is so inelastic, the stuff is still being produced. Think of agriculture. If you have, let's say, chicken, well, they still produce the eggs, but then what can you do? You just cannot throw away the eggs. So in this case, there's nothing else left, but the producer has no other choice but to pay the tax out of their own pocket, which means they have to carry the tax burden. So that is the case whenever we have a perfectly inelastic supply. Then the tax is fully carried by producers. So when the supply is perfectly inelastic. Well, then when is the burden of an excise tax fully carried by consumers? Well, that's the case when now the supply function is perfectly elastic or horizontal. So whenever that is the case, so let's say we have a supply which is like this, and this is our demand. So everything above the supply, so this is the entire consumer surplus. So but now we have a tax. So supply plus tax. And you see the tax revenue is now completely fed by what used to be former consumer surplus. So the answer is when the supply curve is perfectly elastic. So that's the correct answer. So when does a price floor not cause a deadweight loss? Okay, so a price floor is above. Normally it should be, to be meaningful, a price floor means the price cannot be lower than a certain value. So that means a price floor would be completely ineffective. So a price floor says the price cannot be lower than a certain price, but if that price floor is below the market equilibrium, so if that were the price floor, well, the market still clears here. So normally for a price floor to be effective, it needs to be above the equilibrium price. So when does a price floor not cause a deadweight loss? When it is below the market equilibrium price. So likewise, when it's a price ceiling, so a price ceiling should be, to be effective, should be below the market equilibrium price. But if the price ceiling were here, and the government says the price must never be higher than that, well, the market still clears here, no problem. So the price ceiling does not cause a deadweight loss when it is above the market equilibrium price. Which government leads to an inefficient reduction of economic activity? Okay, so we already have seen we reduce economic activity with a price floor, price ceiling, and a tax. But a subsidy led to an inefficient overproduction. Or we also produce too much of a bad thing with a negative externality. So, but all of these examples here reduce economic activity. So, which government intervention leads to an inefficient reduction of economic activity? Well, that's all of these. Which of the following is associated with a suboptimal use of economic resources? Okay, so suboptimal use of economic resources suggests we should produce more of it. Is it a negative externality? No, because a negative externality, we produce too much of a bad thing. A positive externality, yeah, we produce too little of a good thing. So the answer here is B. Which statement is true? Whenever the government sets a price different from the market equilibrium price, there will be winners and losers. Yeah, most of the time that's true. If you remember, we had one example when actually the consumers didn't win. But yeah, most of the time there are winners and losers. So maybe I should say most of the time, at least most of the time. There will be winners and the winners, but what we have seen is whenever there's a dead weight loss, the winners win less than what the losers lose. So it's in this case both A and B. With this modification it makes it clear. So which of the following adds to welfare? Last question. Consumer surplus, of course. Producer surplus, of course. Tax revenues, of course. All of the above. And it could be also still, social benefits from a positive externality, but what we have to reduce, or what we have to subtract from welfare would be a subsidy cost and social costs from a negative externality. Okay, so that concludes the topic on basic economic concepts, and I know it was a long chapter, but yeah, I think we all have now a pretty good fundament in order to build on that in subsequent topics.